In 1862, Mississippi, the air itself seemed heavy, as though the war had pressed its hand against the soil and refused to let go, and in that suffocating heat a boy no older than 12 was already carrying the weight of a lifetime. His small frame moved through fields of cotton, where the stalks rose like a prison wall around him. Each day started before the sun with a horn blast that jolted him awake and sent him stumbling toward the work line. The Civil War raged miles away, but its echoes were felt in every lash of the whip, every whispered conversation about soldiers and freedom, and the rumors that the Union Army might one day come and set them all free. The boy's name was barely spoken aloud by the overseers, as if giving him a name would make him human enough to pity, yet, among the other children, he was called Little Samuel. A name passed from mouth to mouth like a secret meant to keep him alive. He had never seen his mother except in the faintest memory of a woman singing before being sold away when he was still small. His father, he had been told, was gone too. Perhaps taken by the war or sold to another state, but Samuel carried their absence like a scar that no one could see. His body was thin, his hands blistered from the coarse stalks, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that did not match the weakness of his frame. The plantation itself was a strange place, a mixture of wealth and rot. The main house stood white and proud with its tall columns and manicured front steps, yet the cabins where the enslaved lived sagged under their own weight. The smell of sweat and smoke hung in the air, and at night when the crickets sang you could still hear the creak of the chains that were nailed into the posts from older times. The owner, a man named Hiram Phelps, was known for his cold efficiency. He treated his land and the people on it like parts of a machine, and that machine could not afford to break down. It was said that he kept a ledger where he recorded every life and death, every ounce of cotton picked, as if even the suffering of a child could be reduced to numbers. On the day everything changed, the sun was low and mean, and Samuel had fallen behind in the picking. His small hands could not keep up with the demand, and the overseer, a man with a face like leather, had shouted and struck him across the back. Samuel had collapsed, and for a moment the others thought he would rise, but he did not, and that was enough to bring a punishment that would burn into memory. He was dragged toward the post and tied, his cries muffled by the dirt, as the whip cracked again and again until it seemed there could be nothing left of him. The other slaves turned their faces away, some out of fear, others out of the unbearable weight of watching a child beaten until he was still. Even the overseer seemed to hesitate before finally cutting him loose. Samuel's body lay in the dust, limp and pale, flies already beginning to circle, as if nature itself had decided the outcome. They carried him to the edge of the quarters and left him there with the assumption that by morning he would be gone. But that night something strange happened. The air was thick with storm clouds, and the rain began to fall in heavy drops, thunder rolling like drums in the distance, and as the night deepened, someone swore they saw the boy's chest rise just slightly, then again, as if he were drawing air from some hidden place. The others gathered, afraid to speak too loud in case it was a trick of the dark. And yet by morning Samuel was sitting up, his eyes open and clear, as if he had only been sleeping through a long night. The morning after his body had been left for dead was supposed to be a quiet one, the kind of day when the fields would smell of wet earth after the night's rain, but instead there was a hum of fear moving through the quarters, because Samuel was not only breathing, he was awake and staring at the sky, as though the storm had told him something the night before. The older men whispered that no one could take that kind of beating and live. The women crossed themselves and prayed under their breath, some afraid that whatever had brought him back might bring punishment on them all. Samuel tried to stand, though every muscle in his back screamed with pain, but he would not stay down, his legs shaking as if they belonged to someone else. When the overseer came to check on the cabins, he stopped in his tracks when he saw the boy standing there, bare feet in the mud. The man's face twisted, not in pity, but in confusion. He spat on the ground as if to curse what he was seeing, then told Samuel to get back to work, thinking the labor would finish what the whip had started. But Samuel obeyed, slowly, dragging his sore body through the field, and yet somehow by the end of the day he was still there, still standing, even when the others were sent to rest. And this became the first of many nights when the whispers grew louder. Only a few days later, something happened again. Samuel was carrying a sack nearly half his size when he collapsed this time, not from the whip, but from exhaustion. The others ran to him, sure that they were watching him die for real this time. His chest stilled, his skin turned grey, and one of the older women began to cry out loud, but before they could carry him away, he gasped so sharply it made them all jump, and then sat up coughing as though the breath had been forced back into him by some unseen hand. His eyes glassy but determined, he rose to his feet and went back to work as if nothing had happened. By now the story had started to spread beyond the quarters, traveling from one plantation to another, carried on the tongues of people who saw hope where there had been none. They said the boy could not be killed, that he had the spirit of someone meant to live no matter the cost. Some said it was a sign that freedom was coming, that if a child could survive what no man could, then maybe God had not forgotten them. After all, others were not so sure, believing that anything that cheated death might bring more suffering with it. The owner heard these rumors and decided he needed to see the boy himself. When Hiram Phelps came to look at Samuel, he found him sitting by the fire, his back marked, but healing faster than anyone had expected. Phelps stared at him long enough that it made the others nervous, then ordered that he be given extra work as if to test just how strong he really was. Samuel took every task without a word, carrying loads that would have crushed him days before, and still by nightfall he was alive each sunrise, becoming proof that whatever had happened to him was not ordinary. As the weeks went on, the boy's survival became something that could not be ignored. The overseer began to watch him not with anger but with unease, because nothing he did seemed to break him. Samuel's body grew leaner but harder, as if each beating, each collapse only made him more unyielding. There was a fire in him now that had not been there before, and though he rarely spoke, his silence was louder than words. He became a figure. The others began to follow, not openly, but in the way they worked faster when he was near, and in the way they began to share food with him in secret, as if they were protecting something sacred. Soon the nights became the strangest part of life on the plantation, because Samuel's breathing would sometimes stop while he slept, and those who shared the cabin with him would sit up in silence, thinking they were about to watch the life leave him for good. But just when the stillness became unbearable, he would gasp back to life with a sound that made even the bravest men shiver. It was as though he walked somewhere between this world and the next every single night, and yet when the sun came he rose to his feet and faced the day like nothing had happened. There were times when his skin burned with fever and sweat soaked the mat beneath him, but by morning he was strong again, as if his body had healed itself while the rest of the world was asleep. The whispers turned to stories, and the stories turned to something like worship. There were mothers who brought their sick children near him, hoping that whatever spirit protected him might pass through the air to the little ones. There were men who asked him to touch the tools they used in the fields, thinking it might bring them strength, and still Samuel said very little. He only worked and kept moving forward, as if he knew something that no one else could see. The overseer became unsettled by how the others began to look at him, not with pity, but with a kind of awe, because awe was dangerous. Awe could turn into courage, and courage could turn into rebellion. One evening, a man from a nearby plantation came through on horseback, carrying word that Union soldiers had been seen closer than ever, and that sent a ripple through the quarters. Freedom was no longer just a word, it was something that could arrive any day, and Samuel's strange survival was now spoken of as a sign that the world was about to turn upside down. The owner heard the talk too, and though he would never admit it aloud, he found himself unable to look the boy in the eyes for long, as if there was something there he could not understand, something that made him uneasy in his own home. The next incident happened during another punishment, because fear was rising among the whites, and they believed harsher discipline would keep the workers in line. Samuel was accused of stealing food, which may not have been true, but truth no longer mattered. He was tied once again to the post, and beaten harder than before until he fell unconscious. The owner himself watched this time, expecting the boy to die in front of everyone. But before the last lash could fall, Samuel's eyes opened and locked on Phelps with such intensity that the man froze mid-strike. The whip hung in the air for a long moment before it dropped, and Samuel slumped forward, but still breathing. That night, the doctor was sent for a traveling physician who arrived dusty from the road and carried the sharp smell of medicine. He examined Samuel under the dim light and shook his head, saying quietly that no child could take this much trauma and live, that his pulse was faint but steady, and that if he made it until morning, it would be beyond explanation. The doctor left before dawn, but Samuel did not die. Instead, he was sitting up by the time the rooster crowed, staring into the fire with a face so calm it frightened those who saw him. From that day forward, he became something more than just another boy in the fields. He became a symbol of survival that no amount of fear could erase. The others began to talk about running about waiting for the Union soldiers to come, and when they did, they swore Samuel would be the first to walk away from the place that had tried so hard to destroy him. His very existence was a reminder that there were things beyond their control, things that science could not explain and punishments could not stop. And each time Samuel drew another breath, it was like a promise that the story was not over. The weeks that followed only deepened the sense that Samuel was living on borrowed time, and yet borrowing it from someplace no one could touch. There were days when the sky turned black with storms, and he would vanish into the rain, only to return drenched and smiling faintly, as if he had been speaking to something out there in the dark. Some of the elders began to say he had a guardian spirit. Others said he had crossed the river once already and come back with knowledge he could not share. The fear of him grew so strong among the overseers that they began to keep their distance, no longer striking him without hesitation, as though they were worried they might strike something sacred. But that fear did not stop them from testing him again and again. One night he was sent into the woods to haul back lumber alone, a job that should have been given to 3 men. And when he did not return by dawn, the search party expected to find him crushed or missing. Instead, they found him at the edge of the tree line, dragging the heavy logs by himself, his skin scraped raw, but his eyes lit with a fire that none of them could meet for long. Even the owner who had ordered the task stepped back when Samuel let the logs fall to the ground, as if he had just proven something no one had dared to believe. The others heard about it, and for days afterward, they whispered that the boy was no longer just surviving, he was winning. The women in the quarters began leaving small offerings near the place where Samuel slept. Bits of bread, scraps of cloth, anything that might keep whatever force was protecting him from leaving. They said his life was tied to theirs, that as long as he breathed, there was a chance they would all make it through the season and see freedom. Some of the men started holding secret gatherings at night, speaking of escape and rebellion, in low voices, their plans now fueled by the belief that Samuel was living proof that the world could turn in their favor. The overseer tried to break these meetings up, but even he seemed less sure of himself when Samuel was present. One day, a preacher from a nearby plantation was brought in to speak to the workers, hoping to calm the growing unrest. But instead of warning them to obey, he kept glancing at Samuel as he spoke, his words becoming almost a sermon about faith and miracles, saying that the Lord sometimes chose a vessel to show his power, and maybe they were standing in front of one. The owner was furious and sent the preacher away, but the damage was done. The seed had been planted, and now Samuel was no longer just a boy. He was a sign. Soon even the white children of the plantation had heard the stories and came to sneak glances at him from the porch, whispering to one another about the boy who could not die. Their curiosity unsettled the mistress of the house, who ordered that Samuel not come near the main yard anymore, as though his presence might infect her home with the fear and awe he carried. But no matter how far they tried to push him away, his story kept drawing them back like a magnet. When another fever swept through the quarters, taking down the strongest men and the youngest children, Samuel was struck as well. He burned with heat so intense it seemed impossible he could last until morning, but by dawn his fever was gone, and he was sitting outside breathing the cold air as if nothing had touched him. The others looked at him then with a kind of quiet terror, because now it seemed certain that nothing on this earth could take him away. Even death itself had turned him loose. Word of Samuel's survival spread farther than anyone expected until it reached neighboring plantations, and even travelers passing through began to ask about the boy who refused to die, and each retelling seemed to make the story grow taller. Some said he had been struck by lightning and lived. Some swore they had seen him lying lifeless on the ground, and then watched him stand up as if waking from a dream. The owner began to feel the weight of these stories pressing against his control, because they turned Samuel into more than property. They turned him into legend, and legends had a way of uniting people in ways that rules and chains could not. The tension on the plantation grew so thick it could almost be tasted in the air. The overseers now looked over their shoulders when they walked past the cabins, afraid of what might come next. One night Samuel was found sitting by the fire, staring so deeply into the flames that no one dared interrupt him. And later that night, a fight broke out between 2 men in the quarters, but Samuel stepped between them, and without a word, the men stopped, as if some invisible force had passed over them. The women whispered afterward that the boy carried peace with him as well as survival, and that it was not just his life that was charmed, but the lives of those who stood near him. When the doctor returned months later, he was asked to examine Samuel again, this time under the watchful eye of the owner and overseer. He checked the boy's heart, his lungs, the scars on his back, and finally set his tools down, saying there was no medical reason this child should be alive, that his injuries should have left him weak or broken, but instead he was stronger than ever. The doctor left with a pale face, muttering that there were things science was not meant to explain, and the owner could not sleep that night, pacing the floors of the big house as thunder rolled outside. The other children began to gather around Samuel whenever he worked, copying the way he moved, the way he carried the sack, the way he did not flinch when shouted at. He had become a kind of quiet teacher without ever speaking a word, showing them that pain could be endured and that survival was its own kind of rebellion. The older men who had once been too tired to think of escape now watched him closely, some saying they would wait for his sign before making their move, as if Samuel had become the signal they were waiting for to finally run north toward freedom. There were nights when Samuel would disappear for hours, slipping into the trees beyond the fields, and when he returned his face would be wet with tears, though no one knew if they were from sorrow or from some prayer he had sent into the darkness. Some said he spoke to his parents' spirits out there. Others believed he spoke to God himself. Whatever he did in those woods seemed to fill him with strength, because the next day he would work longer and harder than anyone else, as though he had been refueled by something no one else could touch. Even the owner's wife, who had once ordered him kept away from the yard, found herself watching him through the window at night, as if she too was searching for an answer to the riddle of his survival. The house servants reported hearing her crying softly after seeing Samuel walk past whole and unbroken, despite everything that had been done to him, and she began leaving extra scraps of food where she knew he could find them, quietly defying her husband's orders without ever saying a word to anyone. By the time summer turned to autumn, the plantation had become a place of unease, where every creak of the cabin doors at night and every rustle in the fields felt like an omen. Samuel moved through this tension like a shadow, his presence both calming and unsettling to those around him. There were times when he would pause in the middle of the rows and look up at the sky as if he were listening for something that no one else could hear, and it made the others stop too, their work falling silent until he moved again. It was as though he had become the heartbeat of the place, and everyone was unconsciously keeping time with him. One evening, the owner called Samuel to the main house, an unusual thing because he rarely allowed the enslaved inside unless it was for punishment or errands. The boy was made to stand under the glow of the lantern while Hiram Phelps circled him slowly like a man inspecting a piece of land. Samuel did not flinch, did not lower his eyes. He simply stood waiting for whatever was to come. Phelps asked him nothing, just stared for a long time before turning and telling the overseer that the boy was to be kept under watch at night, that no one was to let him wander too far from the quarters, as though keeping him close would keep whatever force protected him under control. But the nights could not be controlled, no matter how many orders were given. Samuel's strange episodes continued. Sometimes he would go so still that those near him thought he had gone for good, and then he would sit up, breathing as though nothing had happened. These moments began to frighten even the strongest among them, because they did not know whether to rejoice that he was alive or fear that death itself was circling close and waiting for them all. And yet Samuel seemed more at peace each time it happened, as though he had touched something beyond fear. Soon travelers began to come just to see him, men on horseback stopping at the edge of the property, asking to lay eyes on the boy who had survived so many beatings and illnesses and storms. They left whispering that they had seen a living miracle, some carrying the story into town, where it was repeated until even those who had never set foot on the plantation knew the tale. The owner hated this attention because it made him feel as if he no longer had complete control over the narrative of his own land. Samuel had become bigger than the place that held him, and that was dangerous. There came a night when the quarters fell silent in a way that felt unnatural. No babies crying, no voices whispering in the dark, just the sound of the wind through the trees. Samuel lay on his mat with his eyes wide open, staring into the rafters, and those near him said later that he spoke a single word, though no one could agree on what it was, before closing his eyes and lying completely still. They waited for him to move, and when he did not, some began to cry softly, thinking this time there would be no gasp, no sudden breath. But just before dawn, Samuel sat up as though he had only been resting and walked outside to stand barefoot in the dew. By now, even the owner's resolve had begun to crack. He stopped ordering Samuel to be beaten and gave him tasks that kept him busy but not broken, perhaps hoping that the boy would simply fade into ordinary life. But Samuel never did fade. He remained a figure apart, a reminder every day that there were forces working on that land that no whip, no chain, and no man could explain. The others followed him with their eyes when he passed. Their conversations would stop. Their hands would still for just a moment, as if they were waiting for him to tell them what came next. When winter crept over Mississippi, the fields turned cold and the nights stretched long, and Samuel seemed to grow quieter, as if he was holding something inside him. The others noticed that he would often wake before anyone else, sitting outside in the frost, staring toward the north as though he could see something moving out there in the distance. His silence became heavy, not empty, but full of something that made the others lean closer when he did speak, because every word seemed to matter more than it had before. There were moments when he would hum under his breath a tune no one recognized, and soon the others began to hum with him without even thinking, as if the sound itself kept them warm. One night the overseer heard the humming and stormed into the quarters demanding it stop. But when he saw Samuel standing there with the faintest smile on his face, he froze, unable to move for a long moment. The other men held their breath, waiting for the whip to strike. But instead, the overseer backed out slowly like a man who had seen something he could not name. And that night, the humming did not stop. It grew louder until it filled the quarters and drifted out into the cold air like a prayer that would not be silenced. A few weeks later, word reached the plantation that Union soldiers had crossed the river and were heading closer than ever, and this news lit a fire in the quarters that even the owner could feel. The enslaved began working with a strange energy, not from fear, but from hope, and Samuel became the center of it all. They watched him closely, waiting for a sign that it was time to run, that the freedom they had whispered about for years was finally within reach. Samuel did not give them a word, but one night he walked to the edge of the fields and stood looking north until the moon disappeared behind the clouds, and that was enough for them to know. The owner sensed this shift and grew restless, pacing the house at night and calling for extra guards to watch the property. But no number of guns could keep the feeling of change from seeping in. It was as if the entire plantation had begun to hold its breath. Samuel still went about his work, but now even the overseer kept his distance from him, no longer shouting his name across the rows, instead choosing to watch in silence, as though he too was waiting for whatever came next. When another illness swept through the quarters, it struck fast and hard, taking down the strongest men. But Samuel was untouched. He moved from cabin to cabin, bringing water, wiping sweat from foreheads, sitting with the dying until their breathing slowed, and still he did not fall sick. Some said the sickness did not dare take him, that he had already been claimed by something stronger, and each person who lived through the fever swore that they had opened their eyes to see Samuel sitting at their side like a sentinel, holding them here until morning. The night the first gunshot echoed in the distance was the night no one slept. The Union soldiers were near enough to taste in the air, and the quarters were alive with the sound of movement as men and women gathered what little they had. Samuel stood in the center of it all, calm and steady, while the children clung to his arms as if being near him made them safer. The owner watched from the porch, unable to bring himself to intervene, because for the first time since the war began, he felt that nothing he could do would stop what was coming, and Samuel turned his head just once to look at him before walking back into the shadows of the field. The morning after the gunfire, the plantation woke to a silence so deep it felt like the earth itself was listening, and Samuel was nowhere to be found. His mat was empty, his few belongings gone, and yet there were fresh footprints in the mud leading away from the quarters. The others followed them until they reached the edge of the woods, where the tracks seemed to vanish, as if the boy had stepped off the earth altogether. Some said he had gone north to meet the soldiers. Others whispered he had been taken by the spirit that had kept him alive all this time, and no one could agree which story was truer. The owner sent men to search the fields, the roads, even the riverbanks, but no trace of Samuel was ever found by midday. The workers stood straighter than they ever had before, picking slower, their eyes on the horizon, as though they were waiting for something to appear when night came and no one had returned with news. The overseer tried to rally them back to work, but his voice cracked under the weight of so many watching eyes. It was as if Samuel's absence had given them a strength his presence never could. Days passed, and the legend only grew. There were reports from travelers that a boy matching Samuel's description had been seen walking along the road heading north barefoot and unafraid. Some said they saw him with soldiers. Others swore he walked alone, carrying nothing but the scars on his back like a banner. The owner became a haunted man, unable to sleep, walking the halls of the house as though Samuel's ghost followed him from room to room, and his wife stopped speaking to him altogether, sitting by the window every night as if expecting to see the boy step out of the dark and onto the porch. The other slaves began to act differently too, no longer shrinking from the overseer's presence, no longer speaking in hushed voices. They began to prepare quietly, sharing food and planning which night they would leave. And though no one said it aloud, everyone knew they were waiting for a sign from Samuel. Even if that sign never came, it was as though his spirit remained behind, guiding their choices, whispering to them in the wind that shook the fields. When the first Union soldiers finally arrived on horseback, they were met not with fear but with calm. And when they asked if anyone wished to leave the plantation, the people moved forward together without hesitation. Some of them swore they felt Samuel's hand on their shoulders as they walked away, and that they heard the sound of his humming somewhere just beyond the trees, leading them onward toward freedom. The overseer did not try to stop them, and the owner stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, looking smaller than he ever had before. Long after the war ended, people in the county still spoke of the boy who would not die. His name passed from mouth to mouth until it became more myth than memory. Parents told their children about him as a way of teaching them courage, saying that some lives are too strong to be broken, no matter what the world throws at them. There were even those who claimed to have seen him years later, standing at the edge of the woods, watching silently before vanishing into the trees, leaving behind nothing but the feeling that he had been there to make sure they were still free.